You just hang up. Hello, everyone. We will start shortly. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Holocaust Education in Times of Uncertainty. This is a series brought to you by the Emil and Jenny Fish Holocaust and Genocide Studies Center at Yeshiva University. I'm Shay Pilnik. I'm the proud founding director of the center. We are here in the next couple of weeks to speak to people that I consider as heroes, leaders in the new, expanding and innovating field of Holocaust education. They are people who interact with educators, with teachers, with students and philanthropists, civic leaders, in order to make sure that never again continues to live and be with us. The series is going to cover Holocaust education across the United States. We are here, by the way, as the Fish Center to let you know that we started to lay the groundwork for our future masters and certificate. We have a terrific university. We have world-class faculty. And what we're looking for right now is you. We're looking for students. We already have 2 courses that will be offered in the fall of 2020. For me, if we are to look and try to map the landscape of Holocaust education in America, the best place to start is the middle of the country. And the best place in the middle of the country to start would be Milwaukee, the gem of Holocaust education, which is the Nathan and Esther Pelz Holocaust Education Resource Center. We're here with my former colleague, Dr. Haumschild, who is the Director of Education at the Nathan and Esther Pelz Holocaust Education Resource Center, also known as HERC. Then, thank you for joining us.
Shay, thank you so much for having me. It's good to see you, and I'm so thrilled, and as is HERC, to be a part of this series. So thank you for having us.
That's wonderful. So then you chose to speak about how Holocaust education plays itself out and what it looks like in a Midwest setting. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your work and describe it?
Sure. Yeah, we at the Nathan and Esther Pelz Holocaust Education Resource Center, or HERC, as you named we're dedicated to creating opportunities for people in Milwaukee and more broadly in Wisconsin to learn about the Holocaust. Our basic mission statement is to remember, to educate, and to inspire. And I think that that's in some ways the trajectory of the work that we do. We were founded by groups of survivors and their families who provide the opportunity for us to remember the Holocaust through their experiences and through their stories. And we've expanded from a speakers bureau into a whole series of opportunities for us to educate people, not only young people, students in schools, at elementary school through high school level, but also people in universities, and then also community members through various community programs. And ideally, these programs, whether they are speakers or field trips, will ultimately inspire communities that are founded on values of tolerance and diversity and dignity and respect for all human beings. That's really what we're trying to accomplish here in the Midwest.
So then we will talk specifically about your journey. You were mentioning some, you're coming up with some generic terms like tolerance, diversity, which are applicable to any situation. You actually have an expertise, your PhD that you are received from the University at Buffalo in upstate New York, in the field of comparative literature, was not concentrating on the Holocaust of European Jewry, but rather on a different genocide. So tell us a little bit about your background and your journey and how you came to concentrate on Holocaust education.
Yeah, it is a very circuitous path, I would say. When I went to the University of Buffalo, I studied, as you said, in the comparative literature department, which itself is a bit of a misnomer. Comparative literature at Buffalo is really a philosophy program. Mm-hmm. And we studied critical theory and a variety of post-structuralist philosophies. And I decided to utilize that training in theory to address, I guess, more what I would call more grounded issues, things that I wanted to see if various theories applied to. So my interest was caught by my mentor there, Dr. Sean Earlham, who was working on testimonies of the Rwandan genocide. And so I followed him to Rwanda for a field study opportunity. And that inspired me to actually begin studying African studies, African history, as well as especially genocide and post-genocide issues in Rwanda, and ended up writing my dissertation about education in post-genocide Rwanda and how that contributes to or prohibits various forms of political and social reconstruction in that zone. So when I ended up working here at HERC, I found it to be a really vital and interesting opportunity for me to take things that had been fairly theoretical, and I had attempted to apply them during my doctoral work, and actually had the opportunity to tinker with various kinds of educational resources that HERC can provide to teachers and to students, and actually see if the theories that I was playing around with in genocide studies had some relevancy in Holocaust studies, and particularly in a setting where the students who are receiving this information are not familiar in a visceral sense or necessarily in terms of their own like cultural memory to the content of the lessons that I'm trying to teach, which was very different than maybe the situation in Rwanda. So
then I assume that when we speak to teachers, students about the Holocaust, for the most part, the facts are undisputable. You mentioned the two terms, Holocaust and genocide. We talk about 6 million Jews. We talk about Nazi Germany. We talk about the 1,000-year Third Reich that lasted for 12 years. When you deal with the subject of genocide, can you give us your definition of genocide, clarify what you mean, and also maybe share with us a reflection on how teachers respond when you apply the term, when you use the term?
Yeah, so genocide is defined in a variety of different ways. The one that I tend to lean on the most is Raphael Lemkin's definition, in which he suggests that genocide is the destruction of the national pattern of an oppressed group and the creation of the national pattern of the oppressor, and that this can happen through biological means, which is to say by eliminating the capacity for that oppressed group to reproduce, through physical means, which is to say killing, or through cultural means, which is one that where he really hit a rubbing point with the UN, where he also believed that various forms of cultural imposition and cultural bulldozing are themselves forms of genocide in which you attempt to eradicate.
In other words, he comes up with a way broader definition of genocide than we would think.
Absolutely, yeah. His term is a bit more, I think, a bit more applicable to a variety of different situations, and so in some senses, we might think that that is problematic, because then you can apply that term to maybe broader contexts. But he still remains incredibly specific, and when you read into him further, he starts to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, and he really gets down to brass tacks. But I find that to be a very useful and powerful way of defining simply the destruction of the national pattern of one group and the replacement of the national pattern of the oppressor. I find that to be a very cohesive and easily accessible entry point, especially when I'm talking to people in places like Wisconsin and oftentimes in rural locations in Wisconsin where they have maybe never thought about the concept of genocide before, much less the Holocaust.
So I have to say, as an editorial comment, I'm very familiar with the work of the Holocaust Education Resource Center in Milwaukee. This is an organization that I led for 5.5 years. We're actually joined now by viewers from all over the country. Then maybe you should describe a little bit your routine and what are the kind of programs you can give us some examples and services, resources that you would be providing to teachers, thinking both about the urban setting in Milwaukee and also the rural setting in Wisconsin.
Yeah, we, like I said, we've expanded substantially since our, when we were founded as an organization that was primarily providing speakers, bureau members, which is to say Holocaust survivors or their children, going into classrooms and speaking with students. And we still offer that as a primary and foundational service of our organization. But in addition to that, we do field trips. We partner with the Jewish Museum of Milwaukee quite often to help institute educational programming that complements especially their Holocaust exhibits that travel through the area. We also do a program where we introduce students to the Jewish faith by doing what we call the FIF program, or the synagogue field trip, as affectionately known, where students come to a synagogue and learn about Judaism, learn about anti-Semitism, hear from a Holocaust survivor. And then a lot of what we do includes actually going out into the classrooms and speaking with students directly, or especially helping with professional development all over the state. We've expanded that side of our programming substantially over the last few years, and that's something that we're expecting to expand significantly more in the near future.
Okay, then I want to ask you another question about your research, but let's take a tiny break and let our viewers know that you have the possibility in the comment section of this Facebook Live broadcast to ask questions. At the end, we will have just a couple of minutes for a couple of questions and answers that I will be happy to address to Dan. So Dan, when I read about your scholarship, you dealt extensively with the way that pedagogy influences political and social structures in the aftermath of atrocity and upheaval. I think that you, in comparison with many other Holocaust education leaders, have the advantage that you worked on a genocide that happened decades after the Holocaust, as a way of coming up with a proof that the subject we're discussing is not only history, it's actually a subject that's relevant to our lives. So you talk about how pedagogy influences political and social structures. Explain to the layman, what exactly do you mean?
Yeah, pedagogy is just simply the methods that we use to teach. And so for me, the how we do things is often equally important to the what. So in the case of the Holocaust, if somebody is very interested in teaching their students about the Wannsee conference or the SS, the what that they're teaching about is, of course, incredibly important to a broad and rich understanding of the Holocaust. But how they teach will also often dictate how those students will come to expect what it means to engage with an authority, or engage with somebody who knows more than them, or holds maybe part of their future in their hands in terms of a grade or something like that. And the way that we interact with one another, which is what pedagogy is founded around, is incredibly important for instilling within our social groups and within our cultural settings, the kind of environment that will actually produce dignity and respect for the other. Because if we're just simply teaching these things through the what and not demonstrating it in our how, then the what we're teaching ends up becoming somewhat hollow. And so what I was studying in Rwanda, and what I try to bring to the table in the work that I do at HERC, is trying to instigate and initiate a type of methodology, a type of teaching, an approach to teaching that actually demonstrates some of the lessons that can be gleaned from the Holocaust, or that can be gleaned from genocide studies, not only in what is being said, but how it is being said and how students are invited to participate in that process.
I see. Why don't you describe to us, when you and I spoke before, you mentioned Imre Kertész, the Hungarian author and philosopher, talking about how the Holocaust impacts our culture, American popular culture. I'm trying to look for the encounter that you have with teachers when you discuss and you talk about one of the most complicated, both emotionally and cognitively, subjects they would probably ever address. So describe an interesting interaction. Your talk is entitled Perspectives and Challenges from the Midwest. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I find most fascinating, kind of as a scholar or an academic, or maybe a recovering academic, I think that you would also maybe be a recovering academic, Shay, is
I used to be recovering, yeah.
The challenge of walking that line between accessibility and what you mentioned, Kertész, what he calls kitsch. So when you first talk about the Holocaust with people, often they think that it's something that is long ago and far away. And that kind of dismissal is a problem that has to be overcome, of course. And then when people begin to understand the Holocaust, or they start to learn about the Holocaust, there comes a certain point in that trajectory in which the Holocaust, as Kertész says, is already a euphemism, where it's the very, very tight single word encapsulation of the stories of the lives of millions and millions of people. And when we use the term Holocaust, we're already giving ourselves a very, very easy pill to swallow, rather than talking about the millions of instances of a neighbor turning on a neighbor or a friend murdering a friend, right? These are much more difficult things to understand. And so there's this interesting line that has to be walked all the time, not only in the work that a teacher does, but I think also in the work that we're trying to do in the classroom and with teachers, of familiarizing teachers and familiarizing the public with the Holocaust while keeping the complexity intact. So something that kind of runs the line in between a dismissiveness and something like incredulity, right? Like being aware of the horrors of the Holocaust and then being so overwhelmed by that they become inured to the realities of the situation, where they think, oh, this must have happened on Mars or something like that. So they can say, yes, I understand that the Holocaust happened, but not quite dig into what that experience might have actually been like for the human being that was going through it.
So the duality you are describing is all about walking the fine line between conveying the lessons, making sure that people would absorb the information, the facts, the process, and at the same time, not absorb it so quickly and so effectively to the point when they feel that actually they can check a box. If I understood what you said, I'm a good guy, I'm great, I know all about the Holocaust, of course I'm committed to never again, and then engage in the practices that led to the Holocaust in their own lives.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is where my interest in methodology or pedagogy comes in, where if we have an approach to the Holocaust in which we create what Roger I. Simon calls Post-it notes, and we are simply tacking various badges of honor. I know about the Einsatzgruppen, I know about the Wannsee Conference, and that's how we're going about our engagement with history. Those Post-it notes can easily be blown around and come flying off of us when something else occurs to us. But if we steep ourselves in various practices and habits of learning and engaging with the subject in a way that is not just simply acquiring some new token of information, but actually inheriting that history and inheriting what that history means for us as a group of human beings, then we're really getting somewhere. And then we're actually engendering a more just and burdened society.
And to what extent would you say that this mission is being taken care of by the teachers? What's exactly the role that a Holocaust Education Center? We're interviewing leaders of centers and leaders of museum. HERC is the quintessential outreach center. It has a small office and a small staff, but it reaches out, if I remember, to close to 30,000 people in Wisconsin every year, which is incredible. To what extent is that? To what extent can the center be of help and be a resource for the teachers? I'm also curious to know what are the unique resources that your center has developed that perhaps teachers in other places in the country could be using?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. And I think it's the daily question that we ask ourselves: how can we be of help, right? And so one of the things that I think that we have done incredibly effectively is to create really powerful working partnerships. One of the things that I'm very concerned with and always aware of is that to make the Holocaust relevant in this area, or I think almost anywhere, we have to be willing to listen to our partner organizations. So as you mentioned, we are an outreach organization. We don't have a space where we can welcome people in to do the work that we do. We always have to be welcomed into the setting into the space of the partner that we're working with. So one, for example, is the Archdiocesan Schools of Milwaukee. And their program, their investment in Holocaust education is very unique and has a very particular focus on the relationship, the Catholic and Jewish relationship throughout the ages, and specifically during the era of the Holocaust. And they want to engender a certain sense of Catholic morality within all of their teachings. So if we just went into that environment and into that partnership with a sort of parachuted kind of cookie cutter program, that wouldn't really work. And we would immediately, I think, turn teachers off and turn the school district off to our approach. And we wouldn't be able also then to learn anything from them and develop ourselves further. So I think one of the things that we do really well is actually listen to the partners that we have and to develop much stronger relationships between us and those that we work with. And I think that that's really a key to keeping Holocaust education relevant, because in the end, it's going to come through the teachers. The work that HERC can do is, I think vast for our size, as you said, about 30,000 people a year. But relative to the size of Wisconsin, much less the Midwest, that is a drop in the bucket. So in the end, if we're not empowering other people who are on the ground every single day doing this work, and we're not listening to them and working with them and helping give them more literacy in terms of the Holocaust, then we're really not accomplishing our greatest goals, I think.
What would you say are the most critical needs of an organization like HERC right now?
Well, of course, we're at a very pivotal moment in which, the founders of our organization, the survivors and their family are, the survivors in particular, that community is dwindling. And so it's incredibly important for us to continue to have innovative ways of engaging with students, because as you have witnessed, when a survivor's in the room with students, the atmosphere changes. And it's a very, very powerful and potent thing. And in the foreseeable future, that's not going to be an option for us to reach out to students and to reach out to teachers. So I think using innovative techniques in the classroom will be really helpful. I think that this era of COVID, when everything has gone virtual, has really challenged us to make our lives a bit more virtual and a little bit more, I suppose, interesting on the one hand. One of the projects that I'm working on right now that I hope people will start to engage with in the coming months is a website in which we are initiating teachers. It's essentially a teacher training website for Holocaust education that I hope will welcome teachers into this curriculum that we have, and essentially give them a boat on which they can then sail across the very challenging waters of Holocaust education. And I'm really hoping that will provide people an entry point into this domain, into this field, so that they can themselves on the ground in an everyday sort of setting figure out how Holocaust education can fit into what they're doing with their students every single day. Because I believe people like you and I would agree that Holocaust education is applicable to almost every field, but it's a matter of making sure that teachers are comfortable introducing this subject to students, kind of no matter where they're reading it.
Correct. What would be, in what way do you think the Yeshiva University new Emil and Jenny Fish Holocaust and Genocide Study Center could be helpful for your center and centers and museums from around the country?
Well, I think having
we did not practice this question before, but let's give it a shot then.
Maybe having an online series where you get to interview us and ask us questions would be great. So
that's a box you already checked.
I believe that the work that you're doing in initiating a master's program will be spectacular. I mean, I think having more programs of that sort around the country that are thinking about the challenges that are greeting us in not only this new era in which there's a generational turnover, but also in a new era in which we're becoming much more aware of the interconnectedness of our histories and our shared histories. I think that's something that's very emergent right now in the American consciousness. And so having a new program at an institution like Yeshiva to initiate people into a rethinking how Holocaust education works in the world, I think is really, really valuable. So, I commend you for being at the forefront of that institution, and I hope that we can continue to work together to find innovative ways to continue to collaborate.
Then you're a former colleague, but a lifelong friend, and I would be happy to continue to work with you. I get a sense from the conversation with you that teachers all too often, even though in Wisconsin, as of now, there is no mandate for them to teach the subject, teachers display a great deal of willingness to teach. They evince a great deal of interest in the field, but sometimes they don't know how, and they don't know how to approach the subject, which tools they have at their disposal. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, there's often, I think there is a very keen sense of honor that people have when they enter the subject, that they want to do right by the subject, that when they enter the field of Holocaust education, Holocaust studies, they are very attentive to the ways that they can stumble and the ways that they can maybe misrepresent what's going on or what happened and this history and the legacy that it has left behind. And I think that sometimes the interest and the investment in Holocaust education is there, and then sort of the guide who can welcome them in their sort of infancy in the field is sometimes lacking, and this is part of what I think HERC and Midwestern, especially centers, have a task of doing, is going out and meeting those people where they are, and then ushering them into a much greater understanding. If we apply the same demands to teachers in Wisconsin as are applied to teachers in New Jersey, for example, where a mandate has existed for many, many years, and there are dozens of institutions dedicated to Holocaust education, many of our teachers will shut down, right? And rightly so. So I think it's our task and it's our duty to go and lend a helping hand, a true helping hand that is very compassionate in its offer, and then very willing to listen again to where it is that the teachers are and what kinds of steps need to be taken in order to get where we're going. One thing that actually came to my mind during one of our fifth programs, which is the synagogue field trip I mentioned before, we were talking about the Torah with a group of teachers from the Catholic schools, and many of them have taught the Holocaust before, but are still very nervous about it. And one thing that came to my mind is that within Hebrew, there are no vowels. And so the speaker has to imbue the sentence with their own breath in order to actually make the words work together, right? And so in some ways, the way that history works is that we have a script that's kind of like the Torah, in which there are missing pieces all over the place. And in order to continue to make it relevant, we have to sort of imbue it with our own spirit. And so these Catholic teachers really want to hold on to like the true facts of the Holocaust, and I think that's a wonderful thing. But sometimes the grip that we have when we approach the Holocaust for the first time is so tight that we don't infuse it with the spirit and the breath that is needed in order to actually make it relevant and make it sort of sing in the classroom. And I think really that's an important thing to remind teachers of, that if you are really trying and doing your research and putting forth a good effort with a great deal of integrity, then you may stumble, right? You may trip. You may not say that vowel sound exactly correctly to continue the metaphor. But if you're doing it with a great deal of integrity, I think you're still speaking in a language that we can applaud and that we can adore, and that we would be very happy to help you improve and practice.
So it seems like the spirit that you're talking about is indicative of how crucial the work of local centers is. From what I'm getting from the conversation with you, the national organizations, they can come up with curricula and resources and websites and modules, but at the end of the day, in order for Holocaust education to work, there has to be a dialogical process. And I thank you, Dan, for being a part of it. The dialogue is really one between the local centers and the schools.
Yeah, absolutely. I keep saying in this building and some of these new projects and some of these new professional development models that I'm trying to create here in Wisconsin, is that we don't really have the capacity with a 5-person organization, 4-person organization to be comprehensive. We have to leave that to people like the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum or Yad Vashem. They have researchers and historians and incredibly smart people doing incredibly smart work all over the place. What we have the responsibility to do is provide people access. So that really is the way that we can initiate people in the Midwest, in Wisconsin and elsewhere, into a conversation with the Holocaust that, again, is something that is dialogical, where it's not just simply a lecture, but it's actually a conversation. And our job is to constantly make sure that it is a conversation that people are willing to have and interested in having, because they see the relevance to their own lives.
So then we are approaching the end of our conversation. Please share with us, you talked about challenges and perspectives. Maybe the most challenging, perhaps most frustrating situation, experience that you had as a Holocaust educator, and also the most uplifting, exciting, epiphanic. Go ahead.
This is one of those interview questions that I always just dread.
So far, so good.
But thank you for it. I'm going to start with uplifting because there's so many I can Rolodex through. One that I will say was spectacular was when I started with HERC, I was the Holocaust Education Fellow at Cardinal Stritch University, which is here, a local university here in Milwaukee. And I was working with HERC part-time, doing work on their educational side of things, and also teaching courses at Cardinal Stritch University in Holocaust history and in the political science department and the history department there. And we worked with Cardinal Stritch University to create a fantastic theatrical production of The Last Cyclist, which is a play that was written in Terezin by some of the people who were imprisoned there. And it was a satire about their imprisonment and about the Nazi regime that flew in the face of everything that was going on in Terezin, which is, of course, a very unique place in the history of the Holocaust. And the play was really spectacular because it brought professional actors in to work with college actors. It brought professional stage crew members in to work with college stage crew members. And my job was to get them prepared through dramaturgical work, which is, say, educational research work behind the scenes to make sure that they could represent what was going on in this play and in that time frame to the greatest ability possible. And by working with professionals and college students in tandem, it created these really, really wonderful dynamic conversations, not only within the theater, but then that percolated out into the broader community. And so over the 2 weeks that the play was broadcast, people, high schoolers saw the play and college students saw the play and members of the community saw the play. And in the time leading up to that, the conversation began to bubble in such a way that various students on campus decided to create their own art show in an adjacent space to the theater, in which they went around campus, especially to art classes, and talked to students about the play and the context of the play, and inspired them to create artwork that was responding to some of the themes that came out in The Last Cyclist. And then they ran an entire art show of their own making in a space adjacent to the theater. So it really was one of those things in which we brought forth this project, and it expanded far beyond our wildest dreams and started a conversation that by the end we didn't really have control over, but it was fantastic because the students and the faculty and the professionals were all in a very dynamic and rigorous and respectful conversation about the Holocaust that we had helped to ignite, but that that spread without our elbow grease, so to speak.
So then The Last Cyclist, written by Carl Schwenk and reconstructed and reimagined by Naomi Pelz. Most challenging, frustrating, more briefly, we're almost running out of time. We have a couple of questions.
Yes, my apologies. Most challenging, I think, is the occasional teacher who I'll run into who does want to tokenize the Holocaust and wants to use it for, is very sympathetic to the mission of our organization. But that sympathy is not also activated by a willingness to sort of engage at a much deeper level, but wants to essentially kind of pave over the Holocaust with a very simplified understanding of what happened there. So it's not really the deniers who I find most challenging, honestly. It's those people who are sympathetic but kind of unwilling to invest.
Okay, now we have two questions. One question is actually for me. Will YU master's program be available online? And the answer is yes. It will take us some time to build the entire program online, but we actually already in the fall of 2020 have 2 courses, which is 6 credits of the entire program that will be offered online. We have generous scholarships on a first time, how do we say that? First time to be served? First come, first served basis. Sorry, I blanked for a moment. I will be teaching a course that is an interdisciplinary exploration of the Holocaust. And Dr. Joshua Zimmerman, who is a world-class expert on the Polish underground during the Holocaust, will be teaching the course, The Historical Survey, The Destruction of European Jewry. The question for you, Dan, is a teacher is asking us, where do I begin in teaching this challenging subject? And also, how do you manage teaching the Holocaust in light of current racial tensions today, which I'm sure Milwaukee has witnessed as well?
The first question was where to begin with teaching the Holocaust?
Yes.
Boy, that's very interesting. The new curriculum that we are building functions on 4 basic domains. The first of which, and where I would encourage people to start, is with intolerance. And intolerance, of course, runs the gamut in the context of the Holocaust. By that, we mean anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, which has a very, very long history. But I think laying the groundwork with intolerance is incredibly important, especially when we look at ancient forms of hatred, anti-Judaism, etc., that essentially rose again and kind of reared their ugly head in the 1930s in Germany. And of course, throughout the modern era, that was a problem as well. So I think starting with an understanding of the history of intolerance is an incredibly important place to begin, so that when one gets to the Holocaust, it doesn't seem like something that came out of nowhere and that has no relevancy to the history that came before it, or maybe no relevancy to the history that comes after it, which is maybe how I would answer the second question. I believe that looking at forms of intolerance and the way that intolerance manifests in various societies at various times and through various mechanisms, right? Whether it's religious intolerance, ethnic intolerance, racial intolerance, these are all things that occur throughout history and throughout time. And by studying the Holocaust and studying it through this lens of intolerance, I think we can really begin to see and learn from these experiences about how intolerance kind of seeps into our institutions in society, how it manifests in not only in individuals, but at much broader structural levels within governments and various institutions. So that'd be my as succinct as possible answer to that very complicated and difficult question.
Yes, it's fairly succinct. Dan, this has been tremendous pleasure speaking to you. I have to say, you are so eloquent and brilliant. I've learned so much from you as a Holocaust educator. I want to applaud you and salute you for the work that you do with the dozens, hundreds actually, of volunteers who are helping you in Milwaukee and your terrific staff. I miss all of you. Our next speaker is actually going to be Kelly Zaney, the Vice President of Education and Exhibitions at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. She's going to speak to us about a provocative subject and quite thought-provoking. Do we need another Holocaust mandate? So please tune in. This conversation will take place this upcoming Thursday at 3 p.m. I also wanted to thank Helena Goodman, who has been terrific helping us with the IT support. Making sure that this live broadcast, webcast, is streaming properly. And also to thank, in addition to the Fish Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Yeshiva University, to all of our partners for this series. I wanted to thank, first of all, the Nathan and Esther Pelz Holocaust Education Resource Center, and for Dan, its Director of Education, for being with us today. And also to thank the Holocaust Center for Humanity in Seattle, the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York City, the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center in Skokie, Illinois, and the Florida Holocaust Museum in St. Petersburg. Thank you so much for this partnership, for conversing with us on the challenges that you are encountering, and letting us know, of course, how we can be a resource and help you. Dan, thank you. This was an incredible conversation, and we should definitely be in touch. See you all Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you.
Thank you.